Thank you for joining me for another edition of EPA Live. I'm Jeanette Lenoir with ePluribus America, and today I am joined by Professor Peter Hepburn. He's the Assistant Professor of Sociology at Rutgers University. He's also the Associate Director of the Eviction Lab at Princeton. Thank you so much, Professor Hepburn. I really appreciate you joining me to talk about a very important topic that seems to be lost in a lot of the happenings around us today. The world seems to be on fire, but there's all kinds of other fires happening as well. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about the problem of evictions in America, poverty, and what it all means and where we're at. And the work that the Eviction Lab does strikes right at the heart of that. So thank you for joining me. And let's just get started. First, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we can talk about what Eviction Lab is.
Sure. First, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I am, like I said, I'm a sociologist and a demographer by training. I'm just starting the fall semester, my fifth year here at Rutgers University, Newark, and I'm excited to be teaching a housing class this fall. My work largely is about sort of different systems and institutions that lead to inequalities in the United States. So a lot of that work has been about housing, but I've also done work that's about employment and employment schedules, and also access to and contact with the criminal justice system.
I see. One of the things that I was reading about was Eviction Lab with its eviction tracking system. You've been tracking weekly eviction filings since March 2020 to monitor the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and associated policies. And I was so surprised by these numbers. But in the 10 states and 36 cities that Eviction Lab tracks, landlords have filed for 1,087,297 evictions over the last 12 months and 88,876 evictions over the last month alone.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what's going on?
I mean, and to be clear, that's, the Eviction Tracker covers about 1/3 of all renters in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So just to extrapolate across the rest of the country, we're talking about many more eviction cases that are being filed nationwide. And kind of at a 10,000-foot view, what you're seeing there is business as usual. So early in the pandemic, we saw really significant reductions in the number of eviction cases that were being filed nationwide, and in part that was because a lot of states and the federal government put into place eviction moratoria. These policies that were meant to stop or to really slow the eviction process, except in unusual cases. And then after that, the federal government, put $46 billion of emergency rental assistance to work in 2021, and we saw a huge amount of money going to pay the back rent that people owed because of hardships arising from the pandemic.
Wow.
And as those eviction moratoria have lifted, and as that ERA money, the rental assistance money, has been used up, there's sort of nothing there anymore. And unfortunately, what that means is we're back to where we were before the pandemic in most places.
Now, what leads to that? What are the correlations to these evictions happening on such a large scale?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the most common listed cause for an eviction case is non-payment of rent. So somebody has fallen behind on rent, and their landlord moves to evict them. And in pretty much any state in the nation, you can do that. A landlord has the right to do that just a few days after rent was due and went unpaid.
Mm-hmm.
In many cases, it doesn't make sense for a landlord to start the eviction process on the 7th of the month if a rent was due on the 5th. Because it's also expensive to go through the legal process and to find a new tenant. But there are states that make that process really cheap and really fast, and landlords do respond to that. And they take advantage of those systems to use the courts as a sort of rent collection mechanism. So just the threat of eviction can be enough to get a tenant who's behind to get back to the table and to do everything they can to make rent before the court moves forward with an eviction case.
Why do you think that a lot of the at least the media conversation has really been about demonizing the renters, but not really focusing on the underlying issues that lead to evictions? Because you hear a lot of landlords complain. They usually seem to have, a legitimate case like, oh, we want, we're struggling too. We need to pay our end as well. But people don't really talk about, at least the media doesn't talk about what gets people to the point of eviction, and also if you can talk about why such a rush to evict rather than working to keep people housed, because the eviction ultimately creates a larger problem within the community that they are a part of.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that there's, the reality of it is that renters um, are and always have been a relatively stigmatized population in the United States, especially the sorts of lower income renters who are most likely to be facing eviction cases. This is a country that has fully embraced the dream of home ownership, and people who can't make it to that threshold always sort of, they're not measuring up to expectations. Um, and I think it's sort of it's easy to tell a story about the tenant who is taking advantage of a landlord, especially a smaller landlord, a mom and pop operator. Um, but that overlooks the realities that the people who are going through eviction cases are often they're low income households. They're
Mhm.
struggling to make ends meet. Um, they are finding themselves in this situation because their car broke down and they had to pay to get it repaired, or they had an unusual medical expense. Something unexpected came up, and they just don't have the savings there to make ends meet in that sort of moment of emergency. Um, and I don't think that necessarily that doesn't reflect a personal failing at a time when the wages that renters make aren't sufficient to make rent, or to make rent and still have anything left over
Mhm.
uh, in most of the cities in America, unfortunately. Um, and I think it's much harder to address the sort of underlying issues about you know livable wages and the supply of affordable housing, and it's a lot easier to focus on the sort of individual failings and moments of hardship.
Yeah, and one of the issues as I was reading some of the work you've done, and I'll let people know to go read some of your op-eds that I thought were really insightful. But one of the things that people don't talk about or highlight is who gets evicted at such a large number, and that's Black women. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've done a bunch of work at the lab just trying to understand the prevalence of eviction, just how many people are getting evicted and who they are. And what we see again and again in this research is that it's Black renters and especially Black women who are being listed on eviction filings.
Hmm.
The rate of eviction for Black households is routinely twice that for white households, and in some cases, some parts of America, that disparity is even larger. Um, and when what we see all too often is that it's the leaseholder who is the person who gets filed against for eviction,
Yeah.
and for Black women whose partners, whose family members may have had previous involvement with the criminal justice system, those individuals won't be listed on a lease. They may be living in a unit, um, but what happens then is it's the women who end up with the eviction case against them, and that eviction case follows them, right? Once you have that mark on your record, it's going to be much harder to find housing the next time, or the year after that, or the year after that. This is something that doesn't go away, right? So you could have an eviction on your record from 10 years back that's still impeding your ability to find safe, stable, and affordable housing, a decade later.
That's so it's just so incredible. It seems
Yeah,
that almost like
it keeps punishing you for one moment of real hardship and difficulty will then lead to this perpetuation of residential instability.
right, and there are other factors as well that a lot of folks who consider themselves too enlightened to focus on it is the racism that many still deal with. And yes, we talked about Black women, but just even discrimination against the poor and racism. Talk about how these factors still impact those who deal with poverty that leads to evictions in the wealthiest country in the world, apparently.
Yeah, no, I mean it's the sheer disparities in in eviction rates by race are really striking. But proving discrimination is more challenging, just strictly from like a legal standpoint. Being able to make a case that there is, for instance, a violation of the Fair Housing Act happening here, which is plausible, but it requires proving that there is real kind of racial animus at play, that there isn't some sort of legitimate business argument that landlords could make. And it's harder to make that case. But one of the I think there was really telling kind of patterns that we've seen in the data is that when you look at the distribution of eviction risk over the income distribution. So looking at people who make $20,000 a year, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. As you go up that income distribution, the risk of being evicted goes down.
Yeah.
But for Black households, the risk of eviction is consistently higher across the whole income distribution. So even a Black household that's making $80,000 a year is at greater risk of being evicted than a white household that's making $30,000 a year. And I think that says something about the ways that race is still really important in understanding these sorts of dynamics of landlords and tenants.
Right. And, the recent Supreme Court case of the city of Grant Pass, Oregon versus Johnson, they've made homelessness like a crime. They've criminalized homelessness. Can you talk about how that change in direction when it comes to housing issues and discrimination? How does that change the game? How does that change your work? Do you have to adjust for this to kind of happen across the board in America?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I mean, the sad reality is that we're just making things that much harder for poor Americans who've been struggling with housing and housing cost burdens and the possibility of eviction. We know that most people who get evicted don't become homeless. The risk of homelessness increases with eviction. But a lot of people who get evicted are able to lease up new units. Some go and double up with friends or family for a while. But as we see eviction filing numbers returning to where they were before the pandemic, and at a time when we've seen homelessness rates in this country reach new highs, there's a real risk that those homelessness numbers continue to go up, and that as cities across the country take a more punitive turn on homelessness, that we'll see just a lot more involvement of the criminal justice system here. And I think that the last 100+ years of criminal justice reforms and counter reforms in the United States don't give me a lot of confidence that this is going to be a productive solution.
Right, right. However, on the other side of that, the DOJ announced that it's going after the software company called RealPage. And RealPage is being accused of basically working with the property managers and landlords to price gouge people. Can you talk a little bit about that and how detrimental that is uh, to all people? I mean, our economy is suffering. Inflation, affordability is still a concern, and now we have this reveal of wait a second, there's something happening here, and we, the
Yeah,
American public are left victimized over and over again in different ways. Can you talk about this case?
sure. Yeah, no, I mean, there is a comforting myth that we tell ourselves that we exist in a free market system where the sort of rents that we're paying are a result of the demand that's out there and are responsive to that. And if demand changes, the rents would go down. And what we see in this DOJ case is a clear case of collusion and price gouging. And that this is coming at a point where rents have just skyrocketed over the last 5 years.
Hmm.
Since the start of the pandemic, nationwide, we've seen double-digit increases in rents.
Yeah.
Those numbers have cooled over the course of the last year. But if you look at where we are in 2024 relative to where we were in 2019, I mean, we're paying a lot more. People are paying a lot more in rent now than they were previously. And a big part of the inflation story was about rents going up.
Hmm.
So, if a driver of that was collusion within landlords and property managers in driving these numbers up, it's not as though inflation just sort of happened out of thin air. This is market manipulation.
Yes, and the American people, we continue to be victimized. How do we ever get to have home ownership? How do we ever get to reach the so-called American dream? Is that dream just a farce today? Well, what are your thoughts on home ownership in the age of AI and algorithm theft and collusion?
I mean, I rent my home. I don't, and for those who don't have a large down payment available to them,
Mhm.
certainly until interest rates start to drop and the market opens up a little bit, everybody's kind of treading water right now and stuck where they are. And for the Americans who are facing eviction and residential instability in the homes that they rent, it's a real long leap from being there to being a homeowner. And I think, we just need to plan better for the reality that there's always going to be different experiences of housing in the country.
Uh, so the American Jobs Plan from the Biden-Harris administration, can you briefly talk about that and how that has helped the eviction rate go down, or has that contributed to resolving the issue of evictions and the work you do?
There's a lot of parts of the American Rescue Plan that directly dealt with eviction and that pushed for shorter term changes that would respond to the pandemic, but also then that laid out new programs for HUD to pursue. The Department of Housing and Urban Development to pursue that would hopefully sort of institute longer term projects. So projects, for instance, to establish the legal right to counsel. So people who face eviction in the country don't. That's a civil court case, and in civil court you aren't guaranteed a lawyer. But there are a good number of cities, counties, and even I guess 5 states now that have some form of right to counsel for people facing eviction. And the idea there is that that changes the power dynamics if tenants have access to a lawyer. Prior to these programs, it would be 3%, 4% of tenants facing eviction would have a lawyer. The vast majority of landlords would. So building out programs like that, hopefully helps to change these dynamics. In terms of other Biden-Harris plans, the sort of longer-term infrastructure plans could make a big difference, especially if they stimulate more construction and the development of more affordable housing.
I see. Any advice, anything that you'd like to leave folks with? Like what have I not asked about this topic that you think is important to know? What should people know, be aware of if they're facing eviction or they could face eviction? And what can you leave us with?
I guess, if you're in that situation and you're potentially facing eviction,
Mhm.
I would urge you to maintain communication with your landlord, try to keep
Mhm.
lines of communication open, and then see about what sort of options are available to you for legal aid and assistance.
Mhm.
The Legal Services Corporation provides, through intermediaries around the country,
Mhm.
legal aid, and there are um, legal aid providers in nearly all cities nationwide who can help with these sorts of cases. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's like, yes, maintain communication with the landlord that's in cahoots with, with another group against you. It's almost like, no, really, trust HR is on your side.
Yeah, but if you don't have the lines of communication open, then hostility is the worst solution for everybody involved.
Yeah. What does the future of eviction look like in America? Is like your work is obviously very important. You have a tracker that folks there's an eviction tracker. The numbers are so staggering, and the fact that black women carry the brunt of that. What does the future look like? Are we going to improve or are we steadily getting worse, especially considering the Supreme Court case, the DOJ's case against RealPage?
I think it's sort of a tale of two Americas, where there are renters in certain places, like for instance, where I live in New York City, we
Mhm.
have a robust tenant protection system in place, and we have the right to counsel. And eviction filing numbers right now are a lot lower than they were in, say, 2018. Um, but there are other places where those sorts of rights are being rolled back, where this system is being made even cheaper, even faster, even more efficient for landlords,
Mhm.
and where these numbers continue to go up. And I worry that like places like Houston, like Atlanta, much of the Sun Belt, what limited protections were available to renters before the pandemic
Mhm.
have only gotten weaker, and I worry that that's a trend that will persist.
Very interesting that you mentioned Atlanta, and this was something I'd never seen before, where there were landlords who had emptied out businesses who didn't pay rent. They were evicted, and their products were put outside. I saw a story about a liquor store, and all their products was just dumped outside, and a hair salon or hair place where all the hair. So people were all over social media saying, "Oh, come out and take stuff," and then they had police having to protect the. So are we going to see any more of those? You think? I'd never seen anything like that before, where an actual business, their products was literally put outside, where people can just take them.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly it happens with residential evictions. I'm surprised to hear it happening with commercial. Seems like if there's money to be made, somebody would try to make it.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, thank you so much, Professor Hepburn. I really appreciate your time. As you know, we end our conversation with a question of the day. And the question of the day, and although it's somewhat of a tragic topic, well, what we just talked about, we're going to move on to something a little lighter. So, the question is I'm not sure if you're familiar, but how would are you familiar with Ray Gunn, Rachel Gunn, who the breakdancing?
Interesting dance performer from the Olympics.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so after making news around the world during the Olympics, Rachel Ray Gunn is set for her first sit down interview actually in a world exclusive with the Channel 10's The Project on Wednesday, so tomorrow. And so, yeah, I wanted to know what your thoughts are on her performance, and what would you rate her? How would
You
you
know
rate?
what? I only caught a little clip of the performance, but I'm a pretty harsh grader, so I'd probably give that one a failing mark.
Wow, but I'm telling you that was just it made the whole world laugh, and I think at a time
Sure.
when we really needed a good laugh. But it
Yeah.
certainly upset the breakdancing community and this whole idea of their culture, which they value so much. But anyways, well, Professor Hepburn, thank you so much. I sincerely appreciate your time and all the information that you shared. Folks know where to reach you. So your op-eds are incredibly informative and keep us in the know. And they can follow you on Twitter and also your work. And you can follow the tracker as well, the Eviction Tracker. Yeah, so thank you all very, very much. I'm Jeanette Lenoir with E Pluribus America, and this is Our American Culture.